This lecture looks at Ukraine from 1917 to 2014. I've divided it into four parts. The first part looks at Soviet Ukraine before the Second World War. In 1917, the Russian revolutions, February and March by the old-style calendar, led to the collapse of the old Russian Empire, and in Petrograd, the capital, a provisional government was formed. Ukraine, over the same period, went through several different stages. First of all, a formation of a Central Rada, or Central Council, which went from March 1917 to the spring of 1918. That was followed by a period called the Hetmanate under Pavlo Skoropadsky, which went from spring to the end of 1918. And the last period was marked by civil war. Ukraine was run by a directory under Petliura, and the Bolsheviks then arrived in January 1919, although the Bolsheviks had several periods when they were in charge of Ukraine. On November 20th, 1917, the Central Rada, led by historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky, proclaimed the Ukrainian National Republic, which they saw as part of a federal Russia. Petrograd, however, refused to acknowledge them and backed instead the local Bolsheviks that formed a Soviet in the city of Kharkiv. And eventually the Red Army backed this communist group as well. On January the 25th, 1918, the Ukrainian Rada declared independence with its fourth universal, although its survival was very dependent on the German army, which was not to last for very long. In March of 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk recognized the independence of Ukraine, but the Central Rada was dissolved when it was unable to provide the German army with sufficient supplies of food. The Germans then backed the military regime of Skoropadsky, who called himself a hetman. The hetmanate then eventually dissolved once the Germans withdrew from Ukraine at the end of the First World War, and the Directory took over. The National Republic under Petliura competed with the Ukrainian Soviet Republic for ascendancy over Ukrainian lands. Western Ukraine also had the similar aspirations for autonomy, and the two Ukraines united briefly in early 1919 and formed a new republic, although it only lasted for 2 weeks. In the spring of 1919, peasant revolts led by Nestor Makhno and Matvey Grigorev and the anarchist movement took over the villages of southern Ukraine. At a number of different occasions, Makhno and his group supported different administrations. Also in the area by the time of the Civil War was the White Army under General Anton Denikin, who was eventually defeated by the Reds and succeeded by Baron Pyotr Wrangel in the south. And Wrangel remained in that area until he was forced out and forced to evacuate. In February 2020, Bolshevik troops occupied Kiev for the third time. And in the same year, the Polish-Russian War, or Polish-Soviet-Russia War, ended with the Treaty of Riga, which divided Ukraine. Mostly it came under the control of the Bolsheviks, the communists. Western Ukraine, for the most part, was under Poland. In the 1920s, Soviet Ukraine saw a period of national cultural development as Lenin sought to gain support with a policy of national inform, socialist in content, and Ukraine was included as, in theory at least, an equal republic of a federal Soviet Union. However, after Lenin died, there was a kind of interregnum period with infighting between leading Bolsheviks, and eventually Stalin consolidated power over his main rival Trotsky by 1928. He reversed a fairly moderate policy called the New Economic Policy in Agriculture, which allowed peasants to sell their surplus grain, and introduced forced 5-year plans in industry and forced collectivization of agriculture. This was disastrous, and grain requisitions by 1932 saw the beginning of a famine in Ukraine, which reached its peak in 1933 with enforced grain collections that caused deliberate starving of almost 4 million Ukrainian peasants, and more if you count the North Caucasus, where half the population was ethnically Ukrainian. After this tragic event in 1937-38, Stalin carried out his Great Purge, a devastating assault on cultural and political leaders, which hit Ukraine particularly hard. At the end of that period, in 1938, Nikita Khrushchev became the Ukrainian First Party Secretary and carried out the final acts of the purges. In Western Ukraine, the lands under Poland, there was more hope for Ukrainian national aspirations. The Ukrainian National Democratic Union was the largest party. It had some representation in the Polish parliament or Sejm. But Poles never really recognized Ukrainian rights, tried to assimilate Ukrainian territories, carried out pacification of villages around 1930. And Ukrainians then resorted to illegal parties, extremist formations. In the 1920s, they moved towards a left-wing outlet in the Communist Party of Western Ukraine. And by the late 1920s, the formation of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, succeeding a Ukrainian military organization, pushed Ukrainian activists in the opposite direction towards a rightist, integral, nationalist direction, initially under Colonel Yevhen Konovalets, who was assassinated by a Soviet agent in 1938. In 1940, in these territories, the organization, or OUN, split into two factions, an older faction under Andrei Melnik and a younger, more radical faction under Stepan Bandera. Both these factions were looking for ways to bring about change in Ukraine and saw Nazi Germany as the likely potential agent because of its ideological feud with the Soviet Union. In September 1939, however, the Nazis and Soviets made a pact, and ironically, this brought unification of Western East Ukrainian territories in 1939 in September, and by the summer of 1940, Chernivtsi and Izmail regions, formerly part of Romania, were also added to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. In this second part on Ukrainian World War II and late Stalinism, we note that Ukrainians units came into Ukraine with the German army, and the Bandera faction briefly declared independence in Lviv, but the Nazis refused to accept an independent Ukraine, began to round up these followers of Bandera, arrested Bandera himself, and he spent the war in Sachsenhausen camp in Berlin. Under German occupation, Ukraine was divided, the Reichskommissariat in the central and eastern part under Gauleiter Erich Koch, a brutal regime, and the general government of Poland under military rule, but with some more civic life permitted. Over 2.5 million Ukrainians fought in the Red Army, and many gave their lives. It's estimated about 900,000 of them died. A further 350,000 or so were deported to Germany for forced labor. As the war proceeded, the German advance stopped. The Soviets regrouped after the Battle of Stalingrad, and thereafter the Red Army started an advance which soon took it back into Ukraine. In October 1942, there was the initial formation of a Ukrainian insurgent army in Volhynia, part of the Bandera faction of the OUN. Their main activities began in spring of 1943 with attacks both on Poles in the region and on the Germans who were retreating. In 1944, UPA did reach an agreement with the Germans to acquire weapons, and a lengthy guerrilla war with the Red Army and secret service units of the Soviet Union took place in Western Ukraine for the next few years, from 1944 onward. The leader of UPA, Roman Shukevich, died near Lviv in 1950, but the guerrilla warfare went on until at least 1953. After the Soviet victory in May 1945, Transcarpathia was added to the western part of Ukraine by agreement with Czechoslovakia. And the post-war period was characterized by purges, deportations, clashes with UPA, mass collectivization of Western Ukraine, and a famine that broke out in 1947 in the east. The Soviets also banned the Uniate Church from 1946 onward. After Stalin's death in 1953, the situation eased somewhat. In 1954, Khrushchev, who by then he was the leader of the Soviet Union as party leader, he called himself the first secretary, he engineered the transfer of Crimea from the Russian Republic to the Ukrainian Republic on the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pereyaslav. After 1943, there was a more liberal regime in place. Even the Ukrainian Communist Party got a Ukrainian as party leader. But Ukraine over the next 2 decades became heavily Russified. Ukrainian language schools were closed. In the 1970s, Ukrainians became part of a dissident movement that tried to make sure that the Soviet Union adhered to the Helsinki Act agreement with Western powers. In 1972, Ukrainian party leader Petro Shelest was removed as leader for being too nationalistic. He was the author of a book called O Ukraine, Our Native Land. He probably didn't write it himself, but nevertheless, he had his name on the cover. And he was replaced by Volodymyr Strebitsky, a more hardline communist apparatchik with close links to Brezhnev, who came from the same area of eastern Ukraine. This continued till 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev became the party leader in Moscow. The Chernobyl disaster the following year caused widespread radiation fallout in northern and western Ukraine, and the evacuation of over 250,000 people, and led to widespread opposition to nuclear plants, environmental movements, and a green world movement that eventually transferred into a green party. Ukrainians felt resentment against central ministries and catalyzed by glasnost, and particularly Gorbachev's assault on Stalinism. It led to revelations about the 1933 famine, never previously acknowledged, about the purges, and a mass grave of victims of the purges was found at Bekivnia near Kiev. Ukrainians began to join political parties from 1989 onward, led by the Popular Movement, or RUK. Also, other parties were the Ukrainian Republican Party, Democratic Party, and several others. RUK was formed by members of the Writers' Union and developed into a mass organization by 1991. In the East, a coal miners' strike in 1989, which had come initially from the Russian Kuzbass minefields, that movement paralyzed Ukrainian coal mines, shut down the steel industry for a while, but there was never really full coordination between the striking miners and a movement like RUK. Leonid Kravchuk, the chair of the parliament at this time, he took over as the party split into two wings. The rank and file in the country as a whole remained fairly hardline, but in the parliament, the communist deputies there began to change considerably under the influence, I think, of the deputies from RUK who had been elected in the 1990 elections. After the August 1991 failed putsch in Moscow, Ukraine declared independence on August the 24th and ratified it with over 90% in support on December the 1st. Independent Ukraine, which formed from that period onward, was beset with a number of issues. The future of the Crimea, which declared autonomy almost immediately and had an independence movement. Nuclear weapons, which remained on Ukrainian territory until 1994. Corruption and energy resources, and these took up Kuchma's presidency until the summer of 1994, when he was defeated by Kuchma. And it was Kuchma who signed a 1997 Treaty of Friendship with Russia, dividing the Black Sea Fleet. But eventually the rise of a movement called Nasha Ukraina, led by Viktor Yushchenko, began to emerge, and this movement took on a good proportion of the seats in the parliament in the 2002 election. Kuchma himself was stymied by an assassination of a leading journalist, the editor of Ukrainska Pravda, who had been assassinated reportedly on Kuchma's orders in 2000. In 2004, fabricated election results which made Viktor Yanukovych, the former governor of Donetsk, the winner, were unraveling, and a revolution broke out in Kiev and other places, where people wore orange scarves and supported Viktor Yushchenko, who it was maintained had actually won the second round of the presidential election. These protests formed a rerun of that second round, and this time Yushchenko won a victory over Yanukovych. However, his presidency was never really very satisfactory. He spent a lot of time traveling and espousing causes which, while commendable perhaps in many regards, took away from the conflicts taking place in his own cabinet. And ultimately, he fell out with his Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko, and appointed Yanukovych, of all people, to be his new Prime Minister. In 2010, Yanukovych made a full comeback, defeating Tymoshenko in the presidential election and forming a cabinet made up of pretty well all Donetsk ministers, including the Prime Minister. And 4 years of fairly corrupt government followed, which featured a refusal to sign an association agreement with the European Union in Vilnius in November of 2013 that led to mass protests in Kiev and many in Western Ukraine as well. These escalated into the new year, particularly after December the 1st, when they were broken up forcibly by the Berkut police sent from the Donbass. And in February 2014, these protests reached a peak and became violent. Yanukovych at this time fled Ukraine, ended up finally in Russia. Ukraine had new parliamentary elections. They had new presidential elections by June 2014, when Petro Poroshenko took over as the new president. By that time, Russia had annexed Crimea, war had broken out in the Donbass regions, and this war continued right up until the Russian invasion of 2022. So, in a nutshell, a very difficult independence period for Ukraine. Started out with a lot of optimism, but really, I think Russia didn't allow Ukraine the freedom to develop as it wanted. That is a European solution, a democratic solution. And as we see today, Ukraine descended into a period of warfare starting in 2014. Thank you.